Capital ships. When World War II began, capital ships stood at the very top of naval power. These were the giants of the sea, battleships and battlecruisers, designed not merely to fight, but to dominate entire oceans through sheer presence. Nations measured their naval strength by how many of these floating fortresses they could deploy. A typical battleship displaced between 35,000 and over 70,000 tons, carried main guns up to 18.1 inches in caliber, and required crews ranging from 1,500 to more than 3,000 sailors. One broadside could hurl shells weighing as much as a compact car over distances exceeding 20 miles. In theory, nothing afloat could survive sustained fire from a capital ship. Early in the war, fleets still believed decisive naval battles would be settled by gunfire alone. This belief shaped strategy, ship design, and training.
Entire task forces were built around protecting these vessels, because losing even one represented not just a tactical defeat, but a national humiliation. When capital ships clashed, casualties were staggering. Single engagements could result in thousands of sailors lost within minutes, as magazines detonated or ships capsized under concentrated fire. Yet these giants carried a hidden weakness. Their immense armor and guns came at the cost of speed, flexibility, and vulnerability to threats they were never designed to face. As the war progressed, capital ships increasingly found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see, could not reach, and could not stop with armor alone. By the end of World War II, capital ships had not disappeared, but their role had fundamentally changed. They remained symbols of power, but no longer the unquestioned kings of naval warfare.
Aircraft carriers. If capital ships represented the old kings of the sea, aircraft carriers were the revolution that quietly overthrew them. At the start of World War II, carriers were still viewed by many admirals as support vessels, useful for scouting but not decisive. That assumption would not survive the war's opening years. A fleet aircraft carrier typically displaced 20,000 to over 35,000 tons, carried 70 to 100 aircraft, and operated with crews exceeding 2,000 sailors and airmen combined. Unlike battleships, their true weapon was not armor or gun caliber, but range. Carrier-based aircraft could strike targets hundreds of miles away, long before opposing fleets ever saw each other. This changed naval warfare at its core. Battles were no longer decided by who fired the first salvo, but by who launched the first airstrike. Entire enemy task forces could be crippled in a single morning, without the attackers ever coming into visual range.
Losses became brutally asymmetric. One side might lose dozens of ships and thousands of men, while the other lost only aircraft and pilots. Carriers also introduced a new kind of vulnerability. They were lightly armored compared to battleships, and a single well-placed bomb could render a flight deck unusable. This forced navies to rethink escort formations, air defense, and fleet coordination on an unprecedented scale. By the end of World War II, aircraft carriers had proven one undeniable truth. Control of the sea now depended on control of the air above it. From that moment on, naval power would never again be measured by gun size alone.
Cruisers. Cruisers were the true multitaskers of the sea, fast enough to chase, powerful enough to fight, and numerous enough to be everywhere. While battleships symbolized prestige and carriers reshaped strategy, cruisers quietly carried the burden of daily naval warfare. Typically displacing 8,000 to 15,000 tons, cruisers were armed with guns ranging from 6 to 8 inches, capable of delivering sustained fire against enemy ships, aircraft, and shore targets. Crews usually numbered between 600 and 1,200 sailors, making them large enough to endure prolonged combat, but small enough to operate independently. Speed mattered. Many cruisers exceeded 30 knots, allowing them to scout ahead of fleets or disengage when outmatched. Cruisers filled critical roles across every ocean. They screened carriers against surface threats, hunted enemy raiders across vast trade routes, and provided devastating naval gunfire during amphibious landings. In night battles and confused surface engagements, cruisers often bore the brunt of the fighting, sometimes facing torpedoes at point-blank range.
Losses could be severe. A single cruiser hit below the waterline might lose hundreds of men in minutes. Yet fleets continued to rely on them because no other ship combined endurance, firepower, and flexibility so effectively. In many engagements, cruisers fought without the glamour of capital ships, but with far greater frequency and risk. By war's end, it became clear that cruisers were not supporting actors, they were the connective tissue of naval power, linking carriers, destroyers, and escorts into a functioning fleet.
Destroyers. Destroyers were the fleet's front-line fighters, fast, aggressive, and constantly in danger. Built to counter torpedo boats and submarines, they evolved into the most versatile surface combatants of the war, operating wherever fleets faced immediate threats. A typical destroyer displaced around 1,500 to 2,500 tons, carried 5-inch guns, torpedo tubes, depth charges, and later radar, and sailed at speeds exceeding 35 knots. Crews usually numbered 250 to 350 sailors, meaning every hit carried devastating human consequences. Their real value lay in reaction time. Destroyers were often the first to engage and the last to withdraw. One of the clearest demonstrations of destroyer resolve came during the Battle off Samar in October 1944. Outgunned American destroyers and destroyer escorts charged a vastly superior Japanese force that included battleships and heavy cruisers.
Ships like USS Johnston and USS Hull, each weighing barely over 2,000 tons, closed to near point-blank range, launching torpedoes against warships more than 10 times their displacement. The cost was brutal. 2 American destroyers and 1 destroyer escort were sunk, with hundreds of sailors killed. Yet their attacks disrupted the Japanese formation, damaged multiple cruisers, and ultimately forced a retreat. No capital ships were sunk, but the outcome of the engagement was decided by destroyers willing to fight beyond all reasonable odds. By war's end, destroyers had proven indispensable. They hunted submarines, screened carriers, escorted convoys, and, when necessary, stood alone against overwhelming firepower.
Escort vessels. Escort vessels were never meant to be famous, yet they decided the fate of global war at sea. Built for protection rather than glory, these ships guarded the arteries of modern warfare, convoys carrying food, fuel, troops, and ammunition across oceans under constant threat. Typically smaller than destroyers, escort vessels displaced between 900 and 1,600 tons, carried modest gun armament, depth charges, and later sonar and radar, with crews averaging 100 to 200 sailors. Their true strength was endurance. Designed to sail long distances at steady speeds, they stayed with convoys for weeks, braving storms, fatigue, and unseen enemies below the waves. The scale of their task was immense. At the height of the Atlantic convoy battles, hundreds of merchant ships could be at sea simultaneously, each one a potential target. When escorts failed, losses were catastrophic. Entire convoys could be devastated in a single night. When escorts succeeded, submarines were driven off, damaged, or destroyed, often without the public ever knowing their names. Escort vessels fought a war of patience. Attacks came suddenly, usually at night, and a single mistake could cost dozens of lives. Many escorts were sunk with little warning, yet replacements kept coming, faster than the enemy could destroy them. Over time, this quiet persistence shifted the balance. By the later years of the war, escort vessels had transformed convoy defense into a system: layered detection, coordinated attacks, and relentless pressure. Without them, fleets would have starved, armies would have stalled, and victory at sea would have been impossible.
Submarines. They fought a war few could see and even fewer could escape. Operating alone for weeks, sometimes months, these vessels turned the oceans into hunting grounds where a single torpedo could decide the fate of an entire convoy. Most wartime submarines displaced 700 to 1,500 tons surfaced, carried 4 to 6 torpedo tubes, and operated with crews of 40 to 80 men in cramped, airless conditions. Speed on the surface rarely exceeded 17 to 20 knots, while submerged movement was slow and dangerous, limited by battery power. Endurance, stealth, and patience mattered far more than raw speed. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. In the Atlantic, submarines sank thousands of merchant ships, accounting for tens of millions of tons of shipping losses. Entire crews could be lost in seconds if a ship was struck below the waterline. Yet the cost was brutal on both sides.
As detection technology improved, submarines themselves became targets. By the end of the war, the majority of crews who went to sea in some navies never returned. In the Pacific, submarines played a different but equally decisive role. Attacking supply lines rather than battle fleets, they slowly strangled an island empire dependent on maritime logistics. Tankers, troop transports, and cargo ships disappeared one by one, collapsing the enemy's ability to sustain war. What made this form of warfare uniquely terrifying was its imbalance. Success might mean sinking multiple ships without ever being seen. Failure often meant no survivors at all. By the war's end, submarines had proven that controlling the sea did not always require surface dominance. Sometimes it only required silence.
Fast attack craft. Built for speed, surprise, and short, violent encounters, fast attack craft turned coastal waters into some of the most dangerous places of the war. These were not ships designed to endure long battles. They were weapons meant to strike first and vanish before the enemy could respond. Most fast attack craft displaced only 50 to 100 tons, carried crews of 10 to 20 men, and relied on gasoline engines capable of pushing them beyond 35 to 40 knots. Their armament was simple but lethal: torpedoes, machine guns, and light cannons. Against much larger warships, their survival depended entirely on darkness, weather, and timing. They fought where big ships could not. Narrow straits, island chains, and shallow coastal waters became hunting grounds for night attacks. A single torpedo launched from close range could cripple or sink a ship many times larger, often before the target even identified what hit it. Losses were sudden and personal. One burst of gunfire or a near miss could wipe out an entire crew. These craft also absorbed casualties at a shocking rate. Thin hulls offered almost no protection, and missions were often repeated night after night. Yet commanders kept using them because the payoff was disproportionate. Minimal resources, maximum disruption. Fast attack craft proved that naval warfare was not only about tonnage or armor. Sometimes speed, nerve, and a few seconds of surprise were enough to change the outcome of an entire night at sea.
Amphibious ships. Amphibious ships transformed naval power into something far more dangerous: the ability to place armies directly onto hostile shores. Before them, fleets fought fleets. With them, navies became the spearhead of invasions that reshaped continents. These ships came in many forms, from massive landing ships displacing 10,000 to 20,000 tons, to small landing craft barely larger than a coastal boat. Their crews ranged from a few dozen sailors to several hundred, depending on role, while their cargo included tanks, trucks, artillery, and thousands of infantrymen. Speed and armor mattered less than reliability. If these ships failed, entire offensives collapsed before the first shot inland was fired. One of the clearest examples of their importance came during the Normandy landings in June 1944. In a single day, amphibious fleets delivered over 150,000 Allied troops, along with vehicles and supplies, across a heavily defended coastline.
Losses were severe. Hundreds of landing craft were damaged or destroyed, but the flow never stopped. Even under fire, waves continued to land, turning naval logistics into decisive combat power. In the Pacific, amphibious ships faced an even harsher environment. Coral reefs, shallow waters, and fortified islands forced repeated assaults under direct fire. Ships were often hit before unloading was complete, trapping crews and troops in exposed positions. Amphibious ships rarely sank enemy fleets, but they achieved something far more decisive. They erased the boundary between sea and land, allowing naval power to determine the outcome of battles fought far beyond the shoreline. Mine warfare. Mine warfare turned the sea itself into a weapon. Silent, patient, and indiscriminate, naval mines did not chase their targets. They waited. And when they struck, the damage was often sudden, catastrophic, and impossible to predict. World War II mines ranged from simple contact mines to advanced magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-triggered weapons. A single mine could carry 300 to over 1,000 pounds of explosive, enough to rip open a hull below the waterline, the most vulnerable place a ship could be hit. Crews often had no warning. One moment a vessel was steaming normally, the next it was flooding beyond control. The scale of impact was enormous. Across all theaters, thousands of ships were damaged or sunk by mines, including warships, transports, and merchant vessels. Mines were cheap compared to ships, yet forced navies to divert vast resources into sweeping operations. Entire sea lanes could be closed, not by fleets, but by fields of unseen explosives.
A striking example came late in the war with large-scale aerial mining of Japanese home waters in 1945. Aircraft laid mines in harbors and shipping routes, crippling coastal traffic. Within months, hundreds of ships were sunk or disabled. Fuel and food deliveries collapsed, and Japan's internal maritime transport system was pushed to the brink without a single major naval battle. Mine warfare imposed a constant psychological toll. Every voyage became a gamble. Speed, armor, and firepower offered no protection against a threat no one could see. By the war's end, mines had proven that control of the sea did not always require confrontation. Sometimes it only required denial. Support and auxiliary vessels. They rarely fired a shot, yet without them, naval warfare would have collapsed within weeks. Support and auxiliary vessels formed the invisible backbone of every fleet, turning ships from isolated weapons into a sustained fighting force. These vessels included oilers, ammunition ships, repair ships, hospital ships, and salvage units. Their sizes varied widely. Some displaced over 20,000 tons, while others were modest conversions of merchant hulls. Crews ranged from dozens to several hundred, often combining sailors, engineers, and medical staff. What unified them was purpose, keeping combat ships operational far from home ports. The demands placed on them were relentless. A single fast battleship could burn thousands of tons of fuel oil in a short campaign, while carriers required constant replenishment of aviation fuel, bombs, and spare aircraft parts. When auxiliary ships failed to arrive on time, entire task forces were forced to withdraw, regardless of tactical success. They also paid a heavy price. Operating without heavy armor or strong defenses, many support vessels were sunk by submarines or air attack. Hospital ships, clearly marked and legally protected, were not immune to danger. Casualties were often high, yet their losses rarely made headlines. Perhaps their greatest contribution was strategic reach. With mobile logistics, fleets no longer depended on nearby bases. Warships could operate across entire oceans, striking repeatedly instead of retreating after each engagement. Support and auxiliary vessels did not win battles in a single afternoon, but they decided which side could keep fighting month after month. Special warfare vessels. These vessels existed at the edge of conventional warfare, where innovation blurred into desperation. Built for specific missions rather than prolonged combat, special warfare vessels represented attempts to achieve decisive effects with minimal resources, or when traditional options had failed. This category included midget submarines, manned torpedoes, explosive motorboats, and disguised Q-ships. Most were small, lightly protected, and often carried crews who understood that survival was uncertain. Some displaced only a few dozen tons, operated by 1 to 3 men, and carried explosive charges powerful enough to cripple major warships if they reached their targets. Their successes were rare but dramatic. A single successful penetration into a harbor could damage or sink capital ships thought to be secure behind defenses. These operations relied on stealth, timing, and extraordinary personal risk. Failure often meant instant death, capture, or disappearance without trace. The human cost was extreme. Crews operated under immense psychological pressure.
knowing that escape routes were limited or non-existent. Many missions were effectively one way, even when not officially designated as such. Yet commanders continued to deploy these vessels because, under the right conditions, they offered disproportionate results. Special warfare vessels did not alter the strategic balance of the war on their own. What they did reveal was something deeper. When industrial power, fleets, and air superiority reached their limits, navies turned to ingenuity and sacrifice to break stalemates. They were not symbols of dominance, but of how far nations were willing to go when the sea offered no easy victories. Thank you for watching until the end.
If this breakdown helped you see World War II naval warfare in a clearer way, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with anyone who enjoys military history. Your support helps keep these stories alive.